September the 22nd of 2005 was a Thursday, and I was sitting in my office in Curitiba when I got a call from the COO of Caliper at the time, Dr. Harold Weinstein. And Harold said to me, I've just been speaking to Johnson & Johnson. They have a high potential development program that they run for their quality, compliance, and regulatory organizations. They're not particularly happy with how the program's going. And I managed to convince them to use Caliper to run the program. I said, that's wonderful news, congratulations. He said, I'd like you to help me run the program. I said, fine. He said, there's a couple of things you need to know. It's okay. He said, first of all, it's a year-long program. It's a year-long program, and it starts on Monday in Rome, in Italy. I said, okay, that's kind of short notice, but we're used to that in our world. He said, there's one other thing as well. The reason that they decided to go with Caliper is I was telling them about this methodology, action learning, which is really wonderful, and we're going to run it as an action learning program. I said, Harold, I've never heard of action learning. He said, don't worry about it. He said, I'm sending you the book. I said, Dr. Michael Marquardt wrote a book. I'm sending you the book. Get on a plane. Get over here. We'll meet on Sunday, and we'll talk about it, and we'll start the program on Monday. So that's what I did. Friday night, I got the book. I got on a plane. I read the book on the plane. We arrived there Saturday night. Sunday, Harold and I spent the day planning how we would run the week session with 24 high potential vice presidents of Johnson & Johnson. And we ran the week of action learning. One of the reasons I think we were able to do it was when we were reading the book, it just made so much sense. It came together. Everything that we knew instinctively about what works in leadership development, everything that made sense in terms of how adults learn, how people learn. So it wasn't so much that I found action learning. I think action learning found me. It made an awful lot of sense, and we sat down and we ran the week as an action learning program, but we were also doing action learning as a faculty. So we were learning action learning by doing it, right? So at the end of every day's session, we would sit down and debrief and ask each other questions and figure out the action for the next day. And then we would reflect on what had happened. We did the action and reflection cycle. The week went really well, so much so that Johnson & Johnson invited us back for a further 39 programs over the next 14 years. And I want to use Johnson & Johnson as one of the examples that we can talk about today. The other example is Nasdaq. And we're in the middle of 5 years of a relationship with Nasdaq. We're in our 8th program of leadership development. And Caliper's run about 100 programs of action learning all over the world. But these are really good examples of how these organizations used action learning, not just to develop their high potential leaders, but also to make impactful culture change within the organization. Johnson & Johnson, when we started working with them, was basically 62 separate corporate entities who didn't really interact with each other. They weren't really an enterprise. They certainly weren't creating synergies or leveraging the power of the enterprise. There were 62 individual organizations, and that wasn't sustainable for them anymore, apart from anything else, because the regulators were starting to say, we see you as one organization. So they had to transform these 62 corporate entities into an enterprise. And one of the ways that they did that was through the action learning programs. They used the action learning programs to drive the cultural change. Nasdaq, many of you may know of as a stock exchange. Everybody knows Nasdaq as a stock exchange. A couple of years ago, they got a new female CEO who sat down with her senior leadership team and said, this is not the future of Nasdaq. There is no future for us as a stock exchange. We need to be a fintech company. Now, Nasdaq was a very highly siloed, very, very effective at executing organization. Terrible innovation, and certainly nowhere near a fintech company. And they certainly were in no position to compete with Googles of this world for data architects and things like that. So they had to change their corporate culture. They had to drive innovation, they had to drive collaboration, all the things that action learning does so well. So we've been working with them to help use the action learning programs to change the corporate culture. So how do we do it? Well, in our experience, here's what happens in most organizations. Think about the old joke, right? How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? So how do you use multi-year programs to change culture? One program at a time. In my experience, you can't go into a CEO of an organization and say, hey, give us 5 years and the keys to the kingdom and let us transform your organization. They're not going to say yes. Even if they know you, even if they trust you, they're not going to say, yes, come on in and completely turn our organization on its head. But if you go in there and do an incredibly effective program, they'll invite you back for a second program, and then a third program, and a fourth program. And if you're smart enough to join the programs together and have an arc towards the culture change that they're wanting to happen, over the course of 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 years, you'll transform the organization. In our experience, here's how most high-potential development programs work. The organization somehow identifies their hypos, either through a well-put-together performance management succession planning process, or more often than not, because the leader of the area says, this is my hypo. But whatever, they identify the hypo, and they send them off on a program. Right? And the programs, occasionally, are really effective. Occasionally, they're not really effective. But almost all of the learning is restricted to the participant of the program. Right? The hypo goes in the program, the hypo gets the learning. Great. The way that we run the programs is completely different. Everybody is involved in our programs. Because if you're going to transform the organization, everybody needs to be involved. So, of course, the Action Learning team is involved. They're working on the project. They're growing and learning as leaders. But the sponsors of the project are also heavily involved. It's not the sponsors of the program, but the sponsors of the project are there to facilitate and help through the process of making sure that the solutions and the recommendations that the team comes up with are actually put into practice. The senior leadership team are involved because the senior leadership team chooses the challenge. Because what are the criteria for the challenges? It has to be important. It has to be urgent. The senior leadership team have to decide what that is. So we spend a lot of time facilitating the senior leadership team through that conversation. What's the most important strategic challenge that you have on your plate right now that you don't have the bandwidth to implement, or that you don't have a ready-made solution? And the senior leadership team is then involved at the end of the process, because the Action Learning team reports out to the senior leadership team. Because it's the senior leadership team that's going to own the solution, that's going to implement the solution. So the senior leadership team is involved at the beginning and at the end. The managers of the Action Learning participants are involved. Not just signing the check saying, yes, you can go off to your high program, but they're involved in a couple of ways. They're involved in terms of helping the leaders grow and develop as they go through the program. They're also involved in helping to measure that growth so that at the end of the program, we can show that they're better leaders at the end of it than they were at the beginning. The Action Learning team reports, their direct reports are involved in the process because in any organization, 2%, 5% of your population are going to go through the HIPO program. It's never a large percentage of your organization that's going to go through the HIPO program. But we're teaching them best-in-class tools and techniques and approaches. We don't want to restrict that to 5% of your organization's population. We want everyone to benefit from that. So we task the participants with cascading the learning down through the organization for a couple of reasons. One, because we want the whole organization to benefit from question thinking and reflection and all the good stuff. But also because, as we know, teaching is the best form of learning. Right? So we task the participants with cascading the learning. And of course your HR or your L&D function are involved because they have to join the dots for the organization in terms of what does all this have to do with the rest of the performance management process? How does this fit into how we measure performance? How does it fit into our competency framework? How does it fit into our succession planning process? Now, what's interesting is when you start to do multi-year programs, is people go through several of the different roles, right? They might start off as a participant, and then they come out the other end, and then we always invite people back, right? If you touch the program, we want you involved in the next program. So you went through it as a participant. Next year, you want to be a sponsor. Oh, I've got a project that would be really great for you. Or you go through it as a participant, and you say, I've got someone in my team who needs to go through next year's. So you go through it as a manager. People get promoted up, and they're part of the senior leadership team. And I'll give you a really good example of that. That very first program that we ran for Johnson & Johnson, one of the participants was Carol Montadon. And she was one of the 24 vice presidents of quality who went through the program. In subsequent years, she was a manager who sent her people through it. She was the sponsor of several programs. And a couple of months ago, Carol was actually made head of quality for the whole of Johnson & Johnson. So, you know, the highest role that you can get on their senior leadership team. The person who was responsible for the J&J programs at the beginning was a lady called Kathy Wengel. She was head of quality at the time. And of course, she was a manager of people who went through the program. She was part of the senior leadership team. She was a project sponsor. She's now head of Johnson & Johnson supply chain. Now, one of the reasons that people want to get involved and want to keep coming back is because the programs are successful. And everybody loves success. Everybody wants to get involved in success. And they start to see that not only are these great leaders coming out of the programs, but they start to see that these great projects are getting done. So they come to you with more and more projects. You do my project, do my project. So you start to have competition for even better projects. But everybody's involved. And that creates a buzz around the whole organization that facilitates that whole process of culture change. Because everyone's seeing the results and everyone wants to be involved. There's pull from the organization instead of, not even push most of the time. Most of the time for hypo programs, there's just indifference, unfortunately. So once everybody wants to get involved, your next challenge then is, are you adding value? Because of course everyone wants to get involved. This is really high profile. We report out to the senior leadership team. It's wonderful. I want to be involved. It's like, okay, but if you're involved, you're going to have to add value. And the way that we do that is everybody has clearly defined roles and responsibilities so we can hold everybody accountable. The action learning team, of course, it's easy to see what their role and responsibilities are. They're responsible for delivering on the project. And I say that because this is a high potential development program where we're developing leaders. As a leader, you need to be able to deliver. This isn't a theoretical exercise, right? You need to be able to deliver on this project when you're working with peers, when you're doing your day job, when you're working virtually, all of those challenges that leaders have to face. They also need to grow and develop as leaders. One of the things that we will tell them is our action learning programs are not pass-fail programs. You complete the program, you get promoted. If you don't complete the program, you're fired. That's not what it looks like. But we do expect you to grow as a leader. It's a failure on everybody's behalf if you come out of the program the same way you went in. The idea is that you will be demonstrably better as a leader at the end of the program. The sponsors have an important role and responsibility because the sponsor is there to help make sure that the project is a success. They're there to be a cheerleader on behalf of the project. They're there to generate excitement amongst their peers in the senior leadership team. And that's difficult because almost always at the beginning, the action learning teams cause a shock to the senior leadership team. Because the senior leadership team mentality, we were talking about MBAs and stuff like that, they're used to case studies. Oh, we'll give them this project and they'll go work on it and it'll be kind of nice. And then all of a sudden, they give this challenge to this group of 20 hypos, and they come up with a corporate restructuring and 2 new C-suite positions that need to be created. And it's a great solution. And there's a rock-solid business case for it. And it challenges the senior leadership team's assumptions, and it challenges the way they think about things. And so it's easy for the senior leadership team to go run scared and say, yeah, that's great, we'll think about it later. No, the sponsors are there to generate that enthusiasm, to get the senior leadership team on board, and to hold the senior leadership team accountable. Hey, you've just spent all this money and all this time working on this problem. You've got a solution, you need the courage to implement it. So the sponsors have a role to find a business owner for the solution. Where's it going to sit in the organization? I mean, these solutions don't happen overnight. You know, it's going to be a 2, 3, 5-year process. So the team might come up with a sustainability plan, but the business has to find an owner, and the business has to help the implementation of this plan. All of that's on the sponsors. So one of the things we recommend is that the sponsors have the project as part of their goals and objectives, so we can hold the sponsors accountable. The managers of the participants, as I said, have an important role to play. Because typically in our program, it's going to take up 20–25% of the participants' time, okay, while they're doing their day job. And that's very deliberate because we're preparing them to take on more senior roles in the organization. They need to show that they've got bandwidth. They need to show that they're capable of doing even more than they're currently doing. Otherwise, how can we promote them? So it's a 25%, 30% ask on top of their day job. And what we do with the managers is say, help your team work through that. Help your participant understand what that looks like. What are the behaviors that you need to adopt that help you be successful? What does delegation look like when you have 25% more on your plate? How do you keep in touch with what you need to keep in touch with, but prioritize accordingly? And then we also ask the managers to measure the growth and development of the leaders. As part of it, I mean, that's part of their job, is to say, how do you know that your people are better at the end of it? And the HR and L&D team obviously have the role of, as I said, joining the dots for the organization in terms of this is what all this has to do with our competency framework, our performance management, our succession planning. And also they have a job to do in terms of helping the organization understand the whole story, you know, joining the dots and turning it into a whole story. None of that is possible if you don't have metrics. The most important thing from our experience is that you must measure the right stuff. We spend a huge amount of time helping the organization develop metrics, metrics, and metrics. Metrics for the project, obviously, because it's a business project, right? The organization is giving you resources. They're giving you headcount. They're giving you money, right? They want a return. What does that return look like? You know, what does the business case look like? What return are you going to get, and when are you going to get it? Now, it's incredible to me that many organizations don't have rigorous metrics for their own projects. Never mind the HR projects or metrics for training. They don't have metrics for any of their projects. They just kind of spend the money and do them and hope it kind of works. I'll give you some examples of the types of metrics that we have in our projects. We did a project with a group of hospitals in the US, and it was a bunch of medical directors and senior nurses who were being developed to become business leaders. And they worked on a project, and at the end of the project, they reported out to the senior leadership team, and the CEO stood up and said, "This is incredible. I just don't believe what you guys have come up with. It's phenomenal. We would have gone to McKinsey, Deloitte, Price Waterhouse, and we would have spent $5 million with them on this project. And I don't think they would have come up with anything as good as what you came up with, because it wouldn't have been as relevant to our organization. You've just saved us that money, and you've come up with a better solution." One of the projects we did with Johnson & Johnson was on human error reduction. And they put together a framework for human error reduction that led to a decrease in human error reduction across J&J, a 33% reduction in human error across Johnson & Johnson. Millions and millions and millions of dollars of savings. One of the projects was on pharmaceutical licenses. You need a license to sell drugs in each of the countries. Johnson & Johnson were at 22% compliance with all of their drugs all across the world. So missing out on massive markets. This team put together a framework that resulted in them getting to 98% compliance. That's billions of dollars of savings. One of the projects we did with Nasdaq was developing a dynamic playbook for post-acquisition integration. You know, they would buy a company for $2, $3, $5 billion, and as we know, most mergers and acquisitions fail because they're not well integrated. They developed a dynamic playbook that saved them multi-millions of dollars when it came to actually integrating. Now, what's interesting is if you're doing a year-long program with your hypos, 20 hypos from all over the world, it tends to cost a lot of money, right? I mean, because you fly them around the world and you give them all these wonderful learning experiences, it tends to cost a lot of money. So let's say it costs $500,000, or $1 million, or $1.5 million. How many of you here could go to your CEO and say, give me $1 million for my hypo program? Right? It's a tough ask. It's a tough ask. But if you go to your CEO and say, give me $1 million and I'll give you $30 million back at the end of the year, they will bite your arm off. I guarantee you. That's a much bigger return than they get from any of their other kinds of projects. And that's why they keep coming back to do more programs. They're getting huge returns on the investment. Not only does the program pay for itself, but it's a better return than they get from any of their so-called normal projects. And that's built into the process. It's a measurement that at the end of the program, everybody can see. Everybody can see it. Of course, it's a leadership development program, so we also want to measure the leadership development. So every single person who goes through the program has leadership development goals. Specified. Here's what I'm going to work on, and here's what success looks like. So whether it's influence without authority, or delegating, or executive presence, whatever it is that you want to develop, here's what I'm going to work on, and here's what success looks like. And then every single participant at the end of the program gets feedback from their manager, gets feedback from their peers on the program, gets feedback from the coaches, and gets feedback from key stakeholders in their day job. And that's all put into a report which talks about the progress that they made during the program, and then acts as a roadmap for future development. So at the end of the program, the senior leadership team has complete visibility to all of their hypos. They can see exactly how they've grown and developed as leaders during the program and the future help and support that they need to continue their development. Johnson & Johnson, 39 programs over 14 years. Every single participant hit their leadership development goals. Which is a great story to be able to tell when you go back and say, should we do next year's program? It's not just, yeah, they had a great learning experience. That's a fine metric. I have nothing against people having a great learning experience. Please God, it should never be your only metric. Right? There are other metrics that you can put in place that show that these people are now better leaders than they were. And then, of course, you've got the metrics around the cultural transformation. So one of the cultural transformations that Johnson & Johnson wanted to do was when we started, they were recruiting 90% of their vice presidents from outside the organization because they simply didn't have leadership bench strength. They didn't have the people ready in the organization. Within 4 years, they had managed to flip that. So 90% were being promoted internally and 10% from outside. And we were able to track that with HR's help. So we were able to show them the transformation as it was happening. So whether it's engagement scores, whether it's retention, whatever it is the metrics that the organization is currently using, you can show how that needle is being shifted program by program. So you need to have the right metrics in place. But once you have the right metrics in place, it's a wonderful story to tell. And when you tell the story, the organization is going to keep coming back and keep coming back and keep coming back. Our job is just to make sure that each program builds on the previous programs so that it's moving in the direction of the cultural change that they want. I mentioned Harold Weinstein at the beginning, who was the chief operating officer of Caliper. And during that first week's program in Rome, You can imagine the chaos, right? This was Caliper's first ever action learning program. You've got 24 vice presidents of Johnson & Johnson going through this new experience, you know, forcing them to ask questions and reflect and all this. You've got the people from Johnson & Johnson who were the faculty who had never run a program like this before, who were terrified of it because, you know, action learning looks really different to a normal program. You know, there's nobody in charge. There's nobody saying, this is what's happening. And Harold's mantra was always trust the process, trust the process, trust the process. And we, you know, it was at the edge of chaos, but it was always trust the process. And one thing I can tell you from our experience of running action learning all over the world, you know, Singapore, China, Brazil, Mexico, the US, Ireland, every level of the organization, government organizations, non-government organizations, businesses, doesn't matter. Action learning works. It always works. It has never, ever, ever failed us. To be honest with you, there's been a couple of times, right? You know, the night before the final presentation, I've turned around to the person who's running the program with me, and I'm like, Joe, we've hit the wall this time. You know, this is the team that unfortunately they gave it a good go, and you know what? They always made it. Because I don't think action learning gives people more potential. But what I think action learning does do is allow them to demonstrate the potential that they've got. It removes the obstacles. And people are capable. That's the weird thing. People are highly capable of delivering wonderful, transformational, powerful, innovative results if you just get out of their way. And that's what action learning does. It helps the organization get out of their way. It helps them get out of their own way. And the results are incredible. Really incredible. You know, you'll have CEOs from Fortune 500 companies with their jaw on the ground saying, I had no idea that our people were capable of this. So one thing I can say to you is trust the process. Trust that action learning works. Trust that the people are capable. And trust that your program will be a success, and so you can do next year's program, and that will be a success. And then the year after that will be a success. And then after 3, 5, 10 years, you'll be able to look back and say, we literally changed the world. Because that's how powerful action learning is. And if Caliper can help with that, it would be our pleasure. You know, we love action learning, and we're more than happy to share our experience, our enthusiasm, anything that we can help with. Please count on us. You know, we are evangelists for action learning. It's been good to us. It's been good to the organizations that we work with. And if there's anything that we can do to help you implement action learning in your organization or know about our experience of what works and what to avoid, please count on us. It's been a pleasure talking with you today. I'll be around, obviously, for the questions now, but also I'll be around all day tomorrow. You also have my contact details here. Please get in contact and ask your questions. You know, let me know how we can help. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Obrigada, Jorge. Perguntas. Quem tem uma pergunta para qualquer um dos nossos 3 apresentadores? If you need a piece of paper to write it down, to organize your ideas.
E se quiserem fazer as perguntas em português também, fiquem à vontade. Eu fiz a palestra em inglês só para facilitar, mas se quiserem, podem fazer as perguntas em português.
Don't be shy, nada de timidez.
Jorge, o que não ficou tão claro para mim é que nesse programa é uma semana intensa de Action Learning, várias sessões, ou é um programa mais extenso que reúne tudo isso, um pouquinho mais da estrutura?
Uma boa pergunta. Normalmente, os programas de altos potenciais são 1 ano. mais ou menos. E a gente tem uma série de residency sessions, onde a gente... In English? Okay, so we've got the translations. Okay, so I'll do it in English and then we can translate. So normally the HIPO programs are a year in length, okay? And what we do is we get them together for 3 or 4 residency sessions during that year where they work together on the problem, and then they work virtually for 2 or 3 months. And that's deliberate because that's what the life of an executive looks like, right? Very rarely do you get everybody together in the same geographical space. So we deliberately set up the program to replicate real life, you know, not replicate, to be real life, right? So they have to learn, how do you align, how do you make decisions, how do you keep people engaged in a virtual environment, which is really interesting. You know, usually they get fairly good when they're all together in the meetings, but then they go virtually and people disappear off, or it's difficult to get alignment. So the program is normally about a year, and then we have 3 or 4 of these residency sessions of say 4 or 5 days, and the rest is virtual.
So this is a question to George. So a lot of executives that I work with haven't had the greatest experience of perhaps different action learning methodologies. So what would your advice be in terms of trying to overcome some of those eye rolls that you get when you mention action learning?
It's a great question. I would point to the successes, not to their experience. Right? I mean, I would use the examples, you know, Mike's got tons of great examples. You can use the examples from companies like Caliber. There's a great study I sent to Helena. It's kind of old now, it's maybe about 10 years old, but the companies that are considered to be the best at leadership development, kind of GE, Johnson & Johnson, those types, the top 6 all use action learning as their go-to methodology. And it's not a coincidence. So there is data out there that you can use. But what I would say is point to the successes, and then the best thing about action learning is just doing it with them. So say to them, look, let's do a session. And the great thing about action learning is you don't need to do a 1-year program to prove that action learning is great. You can do a 2-hour session and show them the power of action learning and say, look, can you imagine what this looks like once we've done a year of it, you know? And so I would show them it, you know, get them to experience. I mean, action learning is experiential. I mean, that's the whole point of action learning, right? So let's do it. And you can say to them, look, you know, all sorts of people are calling things action learning. In my experience, here's what happens in most organizations. They do like that MBA type case study thing, and they call it action learning. It's like, it's not action learning, right? Which is why when we start to ask questions of the sponsors, like, is this on your goals and objectives? Or what happens if this team fails to deliver this project? And they say, well, you know, it'd be a bit of a shame. It's like, okay, that's not the project we're going to choose. It's like, okay, if they fail to deliver on this project, we don't have a future as an organization. It's like, okay, that sounds like a project we might want to do, right? So it has to become real very, very quickly. I mean, to me, that's the power of action learning, and you've probably seen that once it's real.
Yeah, and just to support all that George said, and what we do is we imagine, if they don't tell you, you imagine a problem that you know is affecting them. And you say to the guy, hey, listen, if you give me 6 of your people anywhere here, I can give you a solution to that. And they usually don't believe. So in one place, we did that, and it's 90 minutes. And we did a regional organization. And at the end, people said, wow, it's the first time this group has ever solved a problem like that in under 7 hours. Because normally they meet from morning until night, yeah? So I agree with you. It's showing them, but it's the thing, how do you get them in the room? They have to want to solve that problem.
Yeah.
Thank you, George, for your very insightful sharing. I particularly like the part you share about the metrics. So I've got two questions. The first one is, do you intentionally measure the metrics before the program and then after the program? And the second question is, what are some of these specific metrics that you can share with us?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you have to measure before because you need a baseline so you can show progress. So for the project, it's easy. You know, what's the current situation? And then, you know, what would success look like? Using the metrics that the organization would normally measure. For the leadership development, again, it's easy. But most organizations don't join the dots. So we will do like a 360 at the beginning, right? So Caliper has a personality profile assessment, so we'll talk about people's hardwiring, but we'll do a 360, and then we'll take any of the other performance indicators that they have, and we'll sit the person down and say, okay, go through all of this data, and based on all of this data, what do you want to develop? And it's usually competency-based, because most organizations have competencies. Most organizations don't understand what the competency has to do with what their people do on a daily basis. I mean, sorry, all you HR experts, but you know, they spend a fortune developing these HR competency frameworks, and the organization's like, do we have competency? What's the competency? You know, so part of our job is to show them, actually, the competencies are real things. And they're there to actually measure, or they're meant to be there to measure what's important to drive success. So we're actually joining the dots. And then when they put together their leadership development goals, you talk about what does success look like. So for example, you want to work on influence without authority. Wonderful. Okay, so where are you going to practice that? Well, I've got project A and project B that I need to get off the ground. And normally it takes us maybe 9-12 months to get all the departments on board. And you know, that's usually considered okay. It's like, okay, so if you have a different approach and you get them all on board and get this, you get that you get that project up and running in 6 months, there's a measurable impact there, right? Speed to market, you know, increase in sales, whatever it happens to be. So what you do is you look at how would you normally measure your success, and how can we change that needle, right? Can we make it quicker? Can we make it faster? Can we make it better? And that's how you measure it.
Right. So when we mentioned the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, before Ruby and I started, we asked the direct reports of each manager, what would you like to experience from your manager over the next year? We didn't ask them what was going wrong. We asked them, what would you wish? We used an appreciative inquiry. And then Ruby developed a scale, a competency framework, and so. And then we measured the people against that after. So at the end, we asked them, over the last year, give us some stories of what you experienced from your manager. And it was clear who had moved the needle, who had stayed where they were, and who probably had even, you know, there were very one or two who had not, you know, bothered with it. So we use a qualitative, appreciative inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. And then again, it has to fit in with what the organization's overall trying to do. So like in Johnson & Johnson, when they had 62 individual corporate entities, you know, if you were the quality vice president in company number 1, you had no idea what was going on in company number 2, right? So they had no talent pool. They couldn't just suddenly pull someone out of company 1 and put them in company 2. So they needed a talent pool that was able to move between sectors. I mean, Johnson & Johnson has consumer, pharmaceutical, medical devices, right? So they needed people who could move across the different sectors. And so they chose projects from different sectors, right? So people would learn about the other sectors as they were working through the project. They were also building up networks and getting known about what they're good at. So at the end of the programs, all of a sudden you've got a talent pool of 100, 200, 500 leaders who could step into any open position in any sector. And they would be welcomed because people knew them and knew what they were strong at. So you can measure that kind of stuff. It's really powerful.
Well, I'd like to thank you, George, Val, and Ruby, for a wonderful, enlightening presentation. Well, 2, actually, presentations. Thank you very much. And I would strongly recommend that those who want to ask more questions or investigate more join Brazilian while at the Blue Pub. As from at what time? It's in Campinas, corner with Ribeirão Preto. Okay. What time are you going to go there? Well, you can all go together, apparently, to the pub and continue this conversation, all right? Na esquina da Ribeirão Preto com Campinas. É aqui pertinho. Walking distance, right, Marina? Isso. So that was it. Thank you very much and see you tomorrow.